I'm Greg Dalton, and this is Climate One. We're recording today's conversation in San Jose on stage at the annual conference of BSR, global nonprofit that works with more than 250 companies to build a just and sustainable world. Coverage of climate change in national newspapers has increased dramatically since Donald Trump was elected. Television coverage is also rising, with CNN and Fox registering the biggest increases in airtime. A little different coverage in both of those places. On Climate One today, we'll explore how climate and energy stories are being portrayed and what issues are being covered a little and a lot. We're also pleased to have three guests with us. Amy Harder reports from Washington, D.C. on energy and climate change for Axios and writes a weekly column called Harder Line. Her stories cover the transition of fossil fuel industry and growing global demand for energy. She previously covered similar issues at the Wall Street Journal. Patrick Temple-West covers global energy from New York for the Financial Times. He also writes for the Moral Money column and reports on environmental, social, and governance issues. Aron Cramer is CEO of Business for of BSR. He serves on advisory boards to CEOs at Barrick Gold, Marks & Spencer, and previously for Shell and Nike. Please give them a warm welcome here. Welcome. Amy Harder, I saw that you retweeted a tweet recently from the International Energy Agency saying that existing and planned policies are not nearly enough to really curb carbon emissions. So in your reporting, how do you balance sort of the facts and also the urgency of what those facts are saying?
That's something that I think about every day, and so it's really great to be here to talk about all these issues. So thank you, Aron, and everybody for being here. One of the interesting things about my job is that there's a lot of people out there on Twitter, but also in the real world as well, who think that it's my job as a journalist to say where we should be going to address climate change, as opposed to where we actually are going in this world. And the issues that are in the debate around the International Energy Agency forecasts for global energy demand and emissions. And so I often, I did a column earlier this year, and the headline was something like, it's getting too hard and too divisive to solve climate change. And I just laid out some really obvious but very stark facts, like the world has never reduced greenhouse gas emissions except for briefly during economic crises. And I don't think that's a way any of us want to actually reduce emissions. And I had a whole other series of facts in there as well, just laying out in very big picture terms how this is getting very, very difficult. And somebody, an environmentalist, tweeted that, Axios reporter throws in the towel on climate change. And I thought, well, it's not my job to hold the towel, let alone throw it anywhere. And so I present these facts, which include the fact that we are not even anywhere near on the target to address climate change, even if it doesn't get as many retweets or likes. And I'm okay with that, because ultimately what I think journalism is here for is to present those facts, even if they may not fit with a certain agenda.
Right, and we'll get into that a little later about the psychology. I think there's a lot of sort of wishful thinking, or what some people would call motivated cognition. People sort of believe things that they want to be true. Aron Cramer, I think that happens a fair amount in the sustainability press. There's a lot of people sort of writing things as they want it to be rather than it is. Is that fair?
Well, I think it is fair. I think there's cheerleading is not journalism, and it's important to state a point of view. It's important, I think, to say this is where we need to go, but I think we, as a community actually working on sustainable business, actually do ourselves a disservice if we make it seem far easier than it is, if we suggest that everything is about win-win solutions, because the world is a lot messier than that. So I think having the point of view about the direction of travel is crucial. That's why we're here. That's what we get up to do every day. But also being realistic about how far we've come is essential to maintaining credibility. And if you're not credible, you don't motivate. So I think being grounded in the reality of where we are is very important.
But I think underneath the climate conversation, there's a lot of anxiety and pain, and people just kind of want to believe that we're making progress. Even if we're not making progress, I just want to believe that today because I want to think that my work is having an impact, right? A lot of wishful thinking underneath there. Patrick Temple-West, most economists would say that pollution is a classic market failure problem because few people or institutions pay the full price of the pollution that they put into the air or the water. It's a market failure. So writing for the Financial Times, which is the global paper for global capitalists, how do you think about this story as a market failure story?
Well, we're covering climate change, ESG, and sustainability as a business sector. I have colleagues who cover banking, who cover energy. We want to be covering climate change as a business. Who's up, who's down, who's making money, who's losing money. And there are a lot of different ways into the climate change story. You can go to Greenland and report about how the ice sheets are melting faster than they used to be, as one of my colleagues from London did. Or you can cover things like the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, which folks in this room, I would imagine, know about. We've written stories about that. We've also covered proxy advisors and some of the pending SEC regulations for those, as they are recommending shareholder votes for companies and climate-related disclosures. So there are different ways into this story, and that's how we've been thinking about it at the FT.
Is that story a risk story or an opportunity story?
Both. I mean, something that we want to be talking to is investors who say, look, climate change is coming. Where are the opportunities for us? Where can we talk to meteorologists, climate scientists, and say, Columbia Sportswear, if it's not too cold out, then they won't be selling as many coats. Well, who are the investors who are saying, no, we believe this winter might actually be colder than normal, and we're going to be buying Columbia Sportswear? It's examples like that.
Amy Harder, I'd like to get you on sort of the risk-opportunity balance. I think most people think of climate as a risk because it's been in a very doom and gloom, dark frame. So how do you think about the opportunity-risk balance?
I think this is something that I have been covering a lot this year. One of my first columns in this year was covering the United Nations Climate Conference, which is held at the end of each year. And I remember a negotiator for Saudi Arabia said the following, and I'm paraphrasing. He was saying, if you think about it, we in Saudi Arabia are actually the most at risk due to climate change. And I think that kind of stunned some people, from low-lying nations that won't exist in 50 years, to hear that from a country like Saudi Arabia. But if you listen to what he said, he actually made some sense in that Saudi Arabia is a desert nation, so will be exacerbated with drought. And in addition, action on climate change will erode the economic base of Saudi Arabia, which is the whole purpose of their IPO. Now, putting morality aside, and the blame that people want to place on climate change, it's true that Saudi Arabia will be very on the losing end of both climate change itself and a warming and the actions to address climate change. And so it's a risk for Saudi Arabia. If you look at other countries, now to be clear, the impacts of climate change are on net very negative, but there will be some short-term positive. And if that short-term positive happens in a place like Russia, where they get greater agriculture yields for a certain number of decades, now it won't be forever, but it will be for a certain amount of time, that's going to be an opportunity. And so there's this idea that because we all share one planet, we all need to be in it together, I think is a little bit naive. I actually think, again, putting on my sort of journalist hat and not telling people what they want to hear, but what is actually the case, I actually think climate change will divide the planet further because the policies will hit different countries the hardest, and the impacts of a warming planet will hit different parts of the world differently. And so that's why this is such a tough issue, because with a lot of things, for example, like smoking and the big fight over tobacco companies, smoking is a bad habit that some people engage in that's not good for your health. It's not the foundation of the global economy and has repercussions around the entire world. And so, I think this is one of the reasons why I love covering this issue, because it is so complicated and so nuanced. I was talking recently with an economist at the University of Chicago, former Obama administration official Michael Greenstone. He and I got into this interesting conversation about morality versus economics, so kind of going off the question that you asked, Patrick. And in the light of this talk about Greta Thunberg, sailing across the Atlantic and all those things, this idea of morality is really sticky, because as soon as you start talking about morality, you need to accept the fact that my morals are not your morals. And then where does that leave you? And so then he, as any good economist would say, you need to make it about the money. And that's why he keeps banging the drum of a carbon tax. And maybe we'll talk about that in a minute if you want. But nonetheless, I tend to think that even though climate change brings up a lot of moralistic and altruistic thoughts, that ultimately it's going to have to be about money.
Right, and social movement people would say successful social movements always have that moral dimension. And I interviewed Christine Todd Whitman, who said exactly that. When you put something moral, then all of a sudden compromise is not possible, because who wants to compromise on their morals? Climate stories in the 5 major national papers have increased in recent years. The New York Times has surged from about 100 articles a month during the Obama years to 300 or as many as 500 articles a month recently. Citations in the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times registered similar increases and publish around 50 to 100 articles a month. The Wall Street Journal, if we could see that graphic, the Wall Street Journal and USA Today publish far fewer articles and have not increased coverage nearly as much in the last decade. So we basically have 3 tiers here in the 5 major national newspapers. The Times pulling ahead, the Los Angeles Times and Washington Post in kind of a middle band, Wall Street Journal and USA Today down there at the bottom. Amy Harder, what do you make of that? You used to work at the Journal.
Yeah, I can definitely say that the Journal is doing a lot more coverage on climate change since I left. That's a correlation, not a causation. I can't, I can't overstate how much change has happened in the world since I left the Journal. And so for me, it's a little bit hard to know, well, is it because I left the Journal or is it because Trump became president? Probably more that Trump became president. When I was there at the Journal, there was never any censoring of my coverage of climate change, and that's something I've said publicly and will continue to. However, there was also not a lot of encouragement to cover climate change there. However, earlier this year, and I think also last year, the Journal did a great series on the financial aspect of climate change. But they don't cover climate change. They don't have a climate change team like the New York Times does and continues to grow. So I think that is indicative of this idea that the financial institutions are just slower to embrace climate change compared to sort of the politics and the activism side of things. And so I anticipate that the Journal and, of course, the FT has been great at covering more climate change than the Journal, I would say. I think as institutions, just in the last couple of weeks, we saw the Federal Reserve held a conference on climate change, which I think is pretty striking given President Trump remains in office. I think as you see the concern among financial institutions pick up, you will see it grow in publications like the Journal. Now, if you read the comment section of these Journal articles, which I sometimes do for entertainment purposes, there's still a ton of deniers in there who are wondering, why the heck are you covering this issue? But I think it's great that the Journal is doing it. And one niched area that I've sort of carved out for myself, because I don't think there's a lot of coverage in there, aside from the great coverage of the FT, of course, is this area between what the oil and gas companies are doing in the climate change space, because there's a ton of climate change coverage, like what the New York Times is doing. And there's a ton of coverage of oil and gas, but there's not the overlap of that. And I tend to think that's a really critical area. And it's one reason why I cover it, and hopefully more will as well.
Patrick Temple-West, are there ever pushback at the Financial Times about why are we doing this, or it's not happening among the sort of global corporations?
All the time.
Your audience? Really?
A lot of people see this as marketing. ESG and sustainability, you're just putting this green bond out there for debt that you would have issued anyway. And yeah, people say this is something that it's just Wall Street follows the money, and this is just where the money's going. So we do have a mandate to cover greenwashing. If there's examples of it, we will call it out, and we've done some stories on that front. So there is examples of that we've shown, but yeah, it's institutional and it's political. In Washington, I remember covering some climate change hearing from earlier this year, and you'll see from the Republicans, they'll hold up these articles from the 1980s saying global cooling, we're going to be hitting a deep freeze in the next decade or so. So they will say, well, the science is uncertain. Why do we care about this?
Aron Cramer, what is greenwashing and how do you spot it?
The old Supreme Court passage about pornography comes to mind. I know it when I see it. Greenwashing, I actually want to take on the concept that there is greenwashing. There's no doubt about it. But I think something has really changed in the way companies talk about their commitments on environmental, social, governance issues, ESG issues. Companies have become a bit more bold in terms of what they're aspiring to accomplish. 100% renewable energy, 100% electric vehicles, and so on. So those big objectives have become a lot more prominent. And what that shows is that companies have been, I think, more willing to stick their head above the parapet. When BSR got started, companies were exceptionally timid to make commitments beyond that which they knew they could deliver with 99% certainty. And happily, in my view, those days are, if they're not gone, they're fading away, and companies are being a lot more ambitious. What that means is there's a chance that companies are going to miss their objectives. And the real question for me is, if you're going to make big targets, if you're going to set big targets, which I think generally is a good idea, and you're going to fall short to some degree, be honest, transparent, and humble about it, own it, and talk about why, because that ultimately is, I think, what the world needs. I think that companies can mobilize their staffs, their business partners by setting out big goals, and they may be reached, they may not be. So yes, there's greenwashing out there. Greenwashing is when you pretend that you're doing something you're not. I actually think there's a lot less of that than there used to be. There are two tools, and with apologies to mainstream media, two tools that are out there that are holding companies accountable in ways that didn't exist or didn't exist to the same degree 10 years ago: social media and a company's employees. It's no place to run, no place to hide. I think everything that happens is out there, and I think that is creating a lot of downward pressure in a good way on the prevalence of greenwashing. So I don't want to be naive. That there are PR departments that work very hard. They're very good at what they do. They sometimes overstate what's happening. But I think the equation has changed a lot, and I think I hope that there is less greenwashing, but also space for companies to take risks by saying, we really want to go a lot further. And the question comes back, do you know how to get there? No, we don't, but we're going for it anyway.
Amy Harder, less greenwashing now?
I think there is inevitably less greenwashing as, over the last 5 to 10 years, costs for renewable energy have plummeted, the concerns about climate change have grown, the pressure from investors to companies have grown, and all of that makes the efforts that these companies are doing a little bit deeper than greenwashing. But nonetheless, just taking the oil and gas industry, which I think gets some of the most allegations for greenwashing, and some of it is definitely remains the case. So the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a consortium of big oil companies, and 12 or 13 oil companies, and they, as part of that, they disclose some things like how much money they're putting into R&D. Only some of them are disclosing what percentage of that R&D goes to low carbon technologies. And something like 9 out of the 12, or maybe 7 or 8 out of the 12. And it's like, well, those 5 companies that are not are clearly ones that I would think are doing more greenwashing than the others. Now I need to that was part of one story that I need to go back and figure out who that is. But that's a good example of how to weed out the ones that are greenwashing versus the ones that are actually doing more. I think with oil and gas companies, some of them, particularly the European ones, are really trying to change who they are. They say they're trying to change who they are fundamentally, and I think that inevitably takes time, and that would be their argument. I think, generally speaking, my rule of thumb is, if I don't hear a lot about how much money they're putting into their R&D, but I see a lot of their advertisements on TV and social media, that's a sign that they're probably doing greenwashing.
Yeah, the proportion of television advertising from the energy sector that focuses on renewables is a lot higher than the proportion of capital investment that's going towards renewables. That's a gap that creates cynicism. And ultimately, I would say, is the public served by that? No. I would say companies are not really served by that either, because I think it just creates cynicism.
There's a wonderful story. David Fenton is a communication expert, and he one time tried to place an ad on the Wall Street Journal editorial page right where Exxon had advertised for years. And he's like, I want to place an ad there, a pro-climate ad. And I think at first they said no, and then they came back and said yes, but they raised the price on them to place that ad in that same place. If you're just joining us, we're talking about climate change and energy coverage with Amy Harder from Axios, Aron Cramer, CEO of BSR, and Patrick Temple West from the Financial Times. I'm Greg Dalton. Amy Harder, you wrote recently about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, long opposed to any change on fossil fuels. They have changed some of their language and now say inaction is not an option. Is that change language, or is that change policy and behavior at the U.S. Chamber? Huge player.
Right. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to me, really represents the lowest common denominator in corporate America, because they have to satisfy so many diverse members. I would say for now, it's more talk, a lot more talk and a lot less actual action. But nonetheless, in Washington, words matter more than perhaps some other places. And the Chamber has done a striking shift. Even going back to 2009, they had an official there who wanted to hold a public trial on climate change science, really challenging the mainstream scientific consensus. Of course, fast forward to 2017, they helped fund a study that bashed Obama's commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, a study that was eventually called out by President Trump when he pulled out of the deal. Fast forward to 2 more years, and we are here present day. The Chamber not only supports the climate deal, but is also holding climate workshops, which are closed to the press, which hopefully means something more is being done than just talking. And so I think, it's a slow evolution in there, and that is something that I always point out. Do I call it greenwashing? I probably don't, but nonetheless, I point out that it, for now, doesn't mean that they're changing support for certain policies. For now, the main policies that the Chamber supports, and most Republicans in Congress, is this idea that they support R&D for new technologies. And that's a really safe space politically to be in. The Chamber does support an increase in the gasoline tax to fund infrastructure. So I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that someday the Chamber could support a carbon tax. But we're not there yet. But I think it's significant. And the fact that they are now supporting the Paris Climate Agreement was something that they tried to sort of brush under the rug over the last 6 months. And I'm glad that they're owning up to it on their website. And we'll see, over the next several months, there's companies who tell me that if the Chamber doesn't step up to the plate more, that they might leave the Chamber. And we're seeing that in some other trade associations. And we'll see if there reaches a critical mass where this opposition to big climate policy falls down, and then there'll be sort of a pathway for something big to happen.
PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, 10 years ago left the U.S. Chamber over climate change, long forgotten. But Aron Cramer, it's interesting that the U.S. Chamber is inching toward climate action at a time when we have an administration that is moving in the other direction. How much is the Trump administration, shaping the business behavior? We're in this big era of deregulation.
Well, the last part of your question, I think, is the really interesting part. I think that people have conflated climate action with which many people support. Polls suggest the number of people, as well as business leaders, investors, others, support more and more by the day, with a lot of regulation, which a lot of companies don't like, as a matter of course. And those two things have I won't put it in a passive voice, I'll put it in an active voice. There are a lot of interests in Washington that have actively worked to conflate those two things so that you bring along people who may be neutral on climate change to oppose climate action because it's seen as a proxy for an overactive regulatory state. And I think that's part of the reason why we've seen so much gridlock in Washington. The other thing about the U.S. Chamber is, the big companies are basically more progressive than a lot of small companies in America around climate change, because smaller companies are very worried about more regulation, which raises their costs. And the U.S. Chamber has a lot of small and medium enterprises inside it, so that dynamic is there. You know, with respect to the Trump administration, to try to figure out why it takes the position that it does, I honestly am at a loss. I think, the business community is clear about what it wants. States and cities are clear about what they want. Investors are clear about what they want. 197 countries around the world are clear about what they want. The Trump administration has so isolated itself on this and other issues as well, that it's hard to come up with a rational argument for that position. Clearly, there are some business leaders who are very pleased, not least the coal industry, but let's remember the coal industry employs fewer people than Arby's does in America. So it's not clear to me why defending jobs in the coal industry should become such an important point.
Amy Harder, is there a deal somewhere to be made that the fossil fuel companies that you are following have their eye on? There is some movement. There's now a Solutions Caucus in the Senate. Some Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, tiptoeing, saying our party needs to have an option on climate. Is there a deal somewhere that carbon pricing, carbon fee and dividend, something?
I would say I'm looking at two potential paths. One is, well, I suppose three potential paths. One being nothing happens and status quo. Another is the one you're talking about, which is, either Trump wins re-election or Democrat wins, and there's this opening for a sort of a moderate bipartisan approach, which would be some sort of carbon tax. The backers like to call it a fee dividend, where the money is returned to consumers. I think that has a lot of support from big oil companies and a lot of other corporations. If you talk to them, those backers, a carbon fee, carbon price is inevitable. But when I talk to Republican staffers on the Hill, they say it's impossible. And so trying to find the middle ground in there is always a fun challenge as a reporter. I do think the carbon dividend approach could end up backfiring because it is so prescriptive. They're not letting the lawmakers on the Hill craft it how they want to craft it. And I did a column earlier this year about how the biggest fight over what to do with the carbon tax is what to do with the money. And so I think there's a whole nother sort of tangential coalition of corporations, many of whom I think are in this room, the CEO Climate Dialogue, I think it's called, and they're just telling Congress, we want a carbon price. However you want to put it together, we're fine. So, but in general, there's this middle ground where you have bipartisan support. Somehow enough Republicans come around to the idea. And to be clear, right now we have one member of Congress who's not retiring who supports a carbon tax, one Republican member of Congress. So there's a long way to go. But the other path, the third path, which I actually think is slightly more likely than the middle path, which is that if a Democrat wins, they will try to push something that's far more aggressive, too aggressive, and will not pass Congress, and will have all these corporations that had been sort of inching to the middle, because frankly, Trump is creating this big space on the right, so that corporations are somehow becoming the most reasonable people in the room, with all due respect to the corporate executives in this room. But that's, the world that we're living in under Trump. And so this third path is one where all the political players run back to their corners and nothing gets done because the Overton window, so to speak, has moved so far to the left that nothing happens. So two paths, nothing happens, and one path, something happens. So those are the paths I see.
That Overton window, yeah, what's socially acceptable. We're going to go to our lightning round. I'm going to ask, just mention a noun or phrase and ask you for your first response, first thing that comes to your mind, completely unfiltered from your subconscious. Amy, let's see, first thing that comes to mind, Amy Harder, flight shaming. One phrase, one word, one phrase. What comes to your mind?
Mostly irrelevant.
Patrick Temple West, carbon offsets.
Market opportunity.
Aron Cramer, corporate sustainability reports.
Improve them now.
Patrick Temple West, Bloomberg New Energy Finance.
What was the first word?
Bloomberg.
Bloomberg. Energy finance, competitor.
Aron Cramer, the best sustainability conference other than this one or one you're associated with?
It's like asking me to choose between my children. It's a great question. The people have spoken.
That was the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance conference. Amy Harder, an energy reporter you delight in scooping.
Jen DeLuey at Bloomberg, because she does great work. She's been all over the RFS. And so I take that as a compliment, to be clear. I think she does great work, so therefore it's great when I scoop her. But she does great work on the RFS and a bunch of regulatory things. And
Patrick Temple West, the leader you most want to interview.
Putin.
Amy Harder, the big get you covet most. Big get, so interview or big get.
Something that I've already done or something that I want
that you
to?
want.
Well, I have a competitor sitting next to me, but I guess as long as you don't tell him and anybody listening to this podcast. I think the Vatican is doing a lot of interesting things on climate change, so I would love to interview the Pope.
Both aiming high, Putin and the Pope, okay.
We could interview them together on stage.
Last one for Aron Cramer, a company that you would not accept sponsorship from because their values conflict with BSR.
That is a very good question.
Or you could, the soft answer is a category.
A category. The MISC Foundation, which is run by Mohammed bin Salman, would not be one that I would be interested in.
There we go. Let's give a round of applause for them getting through the lightning round. Public attitudes about climate change are more nuanced than acceptance or denial. It's often seen as binary. You accept or you deny. Yale and George Mason universities have been surveying Americans for several years and breaking their attitudes into 6 categories, from alarmed, concerned, cautious, from alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. Nearly 60% of Americans are alarmed or concerned. That's up significantly than just 4 years ago. Amy Harder, when you look at this, what does that say to you in terms of dismissive? I think that 9% of people who are dismissive, 60% are alarmed or concerned. Does that dismissive or denial voice have an amplified presence in the media?
Certainly, and that's not to blame the media, but it's a reflection of where the political debate is in Washington, D.C. So 8 years under the Obama administration, I very rarely called up, for example, Myron Ebell, who is a top official at this conservative think tank called the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He would probably fit into the dismissive or doubtful category. But he was now an advisor of the Trump transition team, and I talk to him on a semi-regular basis. And so with a president in the White House who doesn't acknowledge climate change and is getting information from people like Myron Ebell, I inevitably have to talk to them sometimes. Now, that isn't to say I quote what they say about climate change. I don't, but they're nonetheless players in this world, and that's the reality that we're operating in. So I do think it would be interesting to sort of compare these circles and sizes to the influence they have, because it's not just Myron Ebell, it's the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which, to be clear, is separate from the news side. It's Fox News, and those are really making the 9% of the 2 9% there far more greater in an influence than the 29 and 30%. I'm actually a little bit surprised that there's 29% of people that are alarmed. I think when I listen in on focus groups, for example, I hear a lot of people are concerned. Very few that would be so alarmed that they would take an additional $10 on their electricity bill. There's this one woman I talked to, a voter in Iowa, and she's concerned about climate change for her children, but she would not support a $10 increase on her electricity bill. And I asked why not. She's like, I'm a single mom of 4. I pay what I can. I think the corporation should pay. And so I think even though I would be surprised if you ask those 30% of people, would you support X increase in your electricity bill and gasoline bill? The answer is probably not, and so that's the disconnect that I see. And then you pair that with the outsized influence of the people who dismiss the scientific consensus of climate change, and you have a really, really difficult, public engagement platform.
And that's exactly what happened in France earlier this year too, with the Gilets jaunes protests.
Right.
Patrick Temple-West, you've written about, this is sort of where people think and what gets covered. There's a lot of stories that are done because they're highly relatable. They may not necessarily relate to big carbon reductions. I'm thinking about straws and cups. Perhaps straws is something that get written about perhaps too much. They come in really fast. You've written about straws and cups. Tell us about that story.
Well, they are important for the consumer brands, Starbucks, McDonald's, that are producing these things, and it is a cost for those companies. They are trying to produce more sustainable, eco-friendly products. I think we were covering those from those companies' perspectives. And yes, it is a relatable way into the climate conversation. Everybody who gets a Starbucks, McDonald's cup, who is using those, and as we've seen with the Trump advertisements on plastic straws, they do have a visceral impact for people. So we've been looking at that as a part of a business segment for those firms.
Aron Cramer, sometimes there's a tension between villainization and accountability in the press, right? There's some things that, environmentalists often, the business model is to villainize, an individual or an institution. So talk about how the tension or way the companies can be held accountable without villainizing them.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting also is I've been in a variety of contexts, as have my colleagues at BSR, where we'll sort of inherit a public dispute between an NGO that is really challenging what a company is doing and a company that's really pushing back. And publicly, it's the dialogue of the deaf. And then you get people in a room, and actually you can build an understanding and real progress. We see that all the time. And so there is something about the public dialogue that pushes people to the ends of the spectrum, which may have some benefit at times, but more often it prevents real progress and a synthesis of the different ideas that a company and an NGO may have. So I and I think my colleagues at BSR, we're more interested in figuring out how we can synthesize those perspectives. Companies can learn from what NGOs see, because often NGOs see the world in a way that a company doesn't and should, and equally, the company will understand how to make progress and how to make it real and also credible in ways that sometimes NGOs don't have the capacity to do. So, that's why we're here, and I think the accountability is important. Journalism is crucially important. We've seen nothing but hugely consequential journalism on a whole range of subjects over the last 3 years in particular in the United States. It's crucial, and the public dialogue sometimes distorts things in ways that are not useful.
Well, and social media distorts too, because you don't build a big social media following by having nuanced, middle-of-the-ground understanding. You build social media following by being bombastic and attacking and villainizing, and then that grows, but it creates that rift that then BSR comes in and fills. Which gets to the revenue models, Amy Harder, for media organizations. A few years ago, newspapers, on the door of death, a lot of them. They think since the election, they've had some growth in subscription. What's Axios' business model, and are you incentivized to write stories that drive more ads, to do clickbait?
To answer your second question first, is definitely not. My editors give me complete freedom to write about whatever I want to write about. They obviously trust me that I'll write about smart things, but never once have they brought up traffic numbers of my columns and any other stories I write. In fact, I was the one who went to my editors to ask, hey, can I get the metrics for my columns? Because I actually don't get it otherwise. And I get it a week after it publishes, so it teaches me to have patience. And I really don't stress about this in my coverage. But Axios is advertising based now. In the next year, we do hope to have a high-end subscription model, which we've talked about in the media press. So it's really exciting, and I just love that my editors let me do that.
We have some questions from Twitter. One question from Twitter: is there a certain beat or niche of climate coverage that you don't see being covered right now that you would like to read about? Patrick Temple West?
Carbon credits. California is a great example of this. The price for the California carbon credit for transportation has hit record highs for 2 months in a row. And it's making more economically feasible the price for biofuel renewable energy projects that when the credit price was lower, we're not getting funded. So I think that's a market. Oregon's doing a similar program to that. Colorado, New York are looking at similar models. So I think it's a natural beat for us to be covering.
I think we have some audiences in the mic. We have mics in the audience if we have some questions from the floor. I believe there's, if you can identify, there we are, in the back. A couple of them moving around. We got about a couple of minutes left. While that's being, I'll ask one more from Twitter. Is there, to any of you, Amy Harder, how would you hope the climate narrative in mainstream media will evolve over the next 5 years?
I hope that so I like to differentiate between print, online, or newspaper, and TV. And given most people get their news from TV, I do hope that TV journalism gets a little bit more nuanced. And I know that's just a lost cause, probably. But I do hope that there's a little bit more room for nuanced coverage in TV journalism. That's not just, I think there's still some some outlets that put people who don't acknowledge climate change on their TV. So I do hope that can be a little bit more deeper on the TV side of things.
There is more coverage, but CNN and MSNBC had climate town halls. The ratings, though, Amy Harder, were disappointing.
Maybe they shouldn't have had it last for 7 hours.
Yeah.
I didn't even watch it for 7 hours.
I didn't either.
I don't have a TV, though, so.
Yeah, I'm kind of a carbon geek and didn't watch much of it either. So do we have questions out here? I wasn't able to see. Everyone's doing it on their phones. Other question for the journalists: how do you balance between advocacy and journalism? Is there a place for giving space and voice to perspectives not based in fact? Amy Harder, you're a straight news person. You're in the fact world, but what about the?
Yeah, well, I'm not. If you mean not based in fact, if you mean rejecting the mainstream science on climate change, then the answer is no. For example, I did a story right when Trump was tweeting about climate change a lot. My editors wanted me to just tell the world who are these people that are giving Trump this information. It's not that many people. It's mostly older white men in Washington, D.C., which I don't know if that's a correlation, but nonetheless, that's who it is. And I reached out to these people for comment, but I didn't allow them to say something that isn't factually accurate. But nonetheless, I did reach out to them. So if that's what this question means, then we don't. In terms of voices to people concerned about climate change, poor people or people in developed countries. I mean, obviously, yes. I think that's something that we should cover more. I personally don't, given my beat is in Washington, D.C., but I do see that more and more. But I do think it's important that journalists are not advocates for climate change. Just like crime reporters are not vigilantes, we should not be climate advocates. And I think that's something that a lot of climate advocates do not understand. So I'm trying to make it clear to anybody who will listen.
Right. We are out of time. We've been talking about media coverage of the climate story with Amy Harder, energy and climate reporter for Axios, Patrick Temple West, reporter with the Financial Times, and Aron Cramer, CEO of BSR. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Please subscribe, rate, review. You know what to do. I'd like to thank our friends at BSR for including Climate One in this conference attended by 800 business executives. I'm Greg Dalton. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.